It's described as Asia's premier security summit. Military officials and diplomats from more than 40 countries are meeting in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue. On Friday, a highly anticipated meeting took place between the defense ministers of China and the United States. CGTN's Miro Liu begins our coverage with this report.
After days of media frenzy, Chinese State Consular and Minister of National Defense General Wei Fenghe and U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin held a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue on Friday. The meeting, which ran 30 minutes longer than originally planned, saw the two leaders have what the Chinese called a candid, positive, and constructive conversation on areas such as Taiwan, South China Sea, and Ukraine.
Both sides agree that the two militaries should implement important consensus reached by the two presidents and carry out cooperation in areas that are mutually beneficial.
Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson Wu Qian said in a media briefing shortly after the bilateral meeting that both China and the U.S. had agreed to continue communicating. And Friday's talk was a good start to resume normal military-to-military dialogues between the two superpowers. Following the high-profile meeting, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida Fumio took the stage to deliver his keynote address, which served as an official opening of this year's dialogue. Prime Minister Kishida talked about boosting Japan's diplomatic and security role in Asia-Pacific, given the Ukraine crisis.
Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. As the security environment surrounding Japan becomes increasingly severe, we will set out a new national security strategy by the end of this year. I am determined to fundamentally reinforce Japan's defense capabilities within the next 5 years and secure substantial increase of Japan's defense budget needed to effect such reinforcement.
The Japanese leader further laid out 5 pillars of what he called the Kishida vision for peace. This includes maintaining and strengthening the rules-based order in Asia-Pacific, enhancing security through a reinforced U.S.-Japan alliance, increasing efforts towards nuclear non-proliferation, and strengthening the role of the United Nations. The tension now shifts to day 2 of the dialogue as U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin takes the stage for the first plenary session. Miro Liu, CGTN, Singapore.
For more now on the security challenges being discussed at the Shangri-La Dialogue, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Jim Walsh. He's a senior research associate with the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Here in Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist. From Beijing, Aina Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. And Henry Wong is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. He, too, joins us from Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Henry Wong, let's start with that bilateral meeting between the Chinese Defense Minister, General Wei Fenghe, and the United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. According to one report, it was a very testy exchange, but other reports say that the discussions were, quote, candid but constructive. What is your assessment? What do you think was achieved?
Well, I think, first of all, it's very, very important that the defense minister of both countries met person in person. This has not been for the last 2 years. So this is very, very important. I think, first of all, they have to meet. And second, I think they said that they'll actually get on that dialogue, but also they try to be, seek the common ground, but also, of course, they still maintain differences. But I think at least we understand each other. We state out the purpose of each other, and then I think this is very important that they have the Shangri-La Dialogue as a platform to really emphasize what China. What are the core interests? What are the Taiwan issue? That it's really integrity of China, and also I think that for the U.S. to say let's manage the risk, let's not getting anything out of control. So I think this is very important that we have this dialogue, and then we have really understanding of each other. So even though we still have some differences, but I think this is a step in the right direction.
Henry, what do you make of the fact that this meeting is taking place at a time when relations between the two countries are at a low. They're not very good right now.
Yes, I think that I see what Secretary Blinken has said in his recent speech, that of course, U.S. does not want to contain China. U.S. wants to see China thrive. U.S. really, just have differences with China, but not really view China as, would like to see China prosper. So if that is really the principle behind that, so then we should reflect that. So I think that probably it's the right move that we have this dialogue, we have this meeting, and also it's so important to have we have the military, we have the defense people, security people meet face to face. Probably the first time. I really think this is really overdue, and I think the message you said is important. We may have a lot of differences. We may have a lot of problems, but let's really not to get out of control. Let's really safeguard the interest of both sides, particularly management, have the guardrail really to avoid this, any potential military conflict, even in the Taiwan, across Taiwan Strait and also South China Sea. So I think this is really a great move at the right time.
Right, Jim Walsh, great to have you with us. Henry mentioned Taiwan there, and it remains one of the major points of dispute between the two countries, between the United States and China. General Wei Fenghe, he criticized the latest U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, saying that it undermines China's sovereignty and security interests. And of course, a few weeks ago, we know that there was some confusion over the decades-old policy, the United States policy of strategic ambiguity. But Austin did clarify, we understand at this meeting, that the one China policy has not changed. So what did you make of it?
Yeah, and that clarification had been made by the White House after Biden's comments, which I think we can probably put in the category of a mistake or, a glitch of some kind. But and that's why, in some ways, my colleague is right. The timing of this meeting was welcome. It was important that they are meeting for the first time, but also meeting at a time when there are when each has concerns about the other. So these meetings, and hopefully they will continue in the future, open lines of communication, reduce the risk of misinterpreting the other side, and dealing with a potential escalatory situation should it arise, all really helpful that both are meeting. Now, on Taiwan in particular, the policy, if you go in the U.S. archives and look at decades of State Department documents that have been declassified, you see that the phrase associated with Taiwan more often than anything else is let's keep it in the icebox. This is an issue that doesn't have to be fought over. It doesn't have to be fought over today or tomorrow. It can be resolved in time, and there's no point in having disagreements when you don't need to have them. And so right now it's about managing that relationship, as has happened for decades. The Taiwan issue has been successfully managed for decades. There have been arms sales. The Chinese have complained. China's done things. The Taiwanese or the U.S. have complained, but they've kept it within boundaries, within guardrails, as the former speaker said. And I think it's about getting back to that stability during a time when a lot is going on, COVID, war, economic troubles. So stability is a key word. So I welcome that in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship.
So, Jim, of course, Taiwan was at the top of the agenda, but what about those other issues that you mentioned a moment ago? The broader security issues in Asia?
My guess is they talked about any number of things. Obviously, near the top of the agenda has to be Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm sure the Chinese defense minister had things that he wanted to say, and I'm sure the U.S. defense minister had things he wanted to say, but that's obviously one of the pivotal things happening now. There's much speculation about potential for a North Korean nuclear test. We had officials, Chinese officials in the UN commenting on that earlier this week during a sanctions vote. I'm sure they talked about that. So there are any number of issues, but certainly Ukraine, North Korea, and Taiwan would have headed the list.
Aina Tangen, Beijing and Washington have diverse views on a whole range of issues, and of course they've been engaged in this trade war since 2018. Do you think these face-to-face talks will get past the rhetoric that we've been hearing for the past few years and get into something more concrete?
No, unfortunately, I don't. And while I respect my colleagues, I think they have an alternative view than many here in Beijing have, which is, this was China's attempt to say, let's have less confrontations. And this is the U.S. saying, look, we just need guardrails because we intend to have more of these things. I mean, talking about Taiwan Straits, all this stuff. I mean, it's really, this isn't the kind of dialogue that you want. Yes, it was frank. Yes, they stressed communications. But, it's a situation where both sides feel very strongly that the other one is the aggressor. And these are the kind of situations where you can easily sleepwalk into war. Now, you can poo-poo what's happening in Taiwan, but the fact is the status quo has changed. Joe Biden has mentioned, the strategic ambiguity, putting it away 3 times. I don't think that could be put down to as a slip of the tongue or a mistake anymore. So, I mean, there are legitimate concerns here. Hopefully, they can establish lines of communications. But if Washington and Beijing still have opposing views, all the communication in the world isn't going to change that.
Jim Walsh, what do you make of Ina's point there, that both sides do actually see each other as the aggressor?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that both sides see each other both as parties with whom there has to be necessary cooperation and where there is rivalry. And one of the hot spots of that, I mean, this is not a recent thing, all right? So we've been at this for 4 decades. And so it's always been a sore point. Now, I would agree that the way in which it's talked about has changed over the past 10 years in a way that is sort of challenging that status quo. But I come back to, and I agree that, if you're determined to go after each other, if you have problems that are irreconcilable, then all the talk in the world won't matter. But I don't think that's where we are right now. And I think talking does help, and reducing misperceptions and building confidence helps. And I think, as I said before, this is happening in a context where COVID continues, where we're looking at a future economic global slowdown, everyone says that, and where there's a war that is contributing to all those other things. And so I think it would make sense if leaders are going to pull back on their aggressiveness, their aggressive rhetoric, and try to get some stability and have one less problem to deal with when all these other problems that, weren't around 3 years ago are suddenly on the scene.
Saurabh Gupta, the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he's been talking about the relationship. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We are not looking for conflict or a new Cold War. To the contrary, we're determined to avoid both. We don't seek to block China from its role as a major power, nor to stop China, or any other country for that matter, from growing their economy or advancing the interests of their people. President Biden believes this decade will be decisive. The actions that we take at home and with countries worldwide will determine whether our shared vision of the future will be realized. To succeed in this decisive decade, the Biden administration's strategy can be summed up in 3 words: invest, align, compete.
So, Saurabh, that's the view of the United States Secretary of State there. But if we look at what's been happening recently, I mean, the United States has formed new alliances with its allies in that part of the world, in Asia. I'm thinking of things like AUKUS. We just heard the Japanese Prime Minister talk about beefing up its military. Washington wants to build a string of missile sites along what's known as the First Island chain. So when you look at all those things, I mean, where is the common ground for these two sides to make progress?
I don't think there is much common ground to make progress. I think there is some ground to stabilize the relationship, and that's what they're aiming towards, set a flow. Remember, when the Trump team was in office, there was no flow. You didn't know how deep the relationship would sink. To the credit of the Biden team is that they are trying to set a flow and trying to stabilize the relationship, create some guardrails, albeit in this framework of competition. And what they are essentially trying to do, as they say, is shape the environment around China, and to shape that environment around China from a geopolitical and a geoeconomic perspective, they're going ahead with their China minus strategy, be it in IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or the Quad, where China could easily take up many of these responsibilities but is deliberately kept out. The one point I would say about Mr. Blinken's speech, yes, it was courteous, it was respectful, and it was stabilizing, but he conflicts and makes one huge mistake. And that mistake is that he talks of China being a challenge to the international system. No, that's not the issue. That's not the case. China is a challenge to the US's dominance in the international system. And those are two very different things. And the US needs to look at this differently.
And so wasn't he trying in that speech to dispel this notion, which we hear very often, that the United States is trying to contain China?
Yes, exactly. And that's why he was talking in terms of a positive agenda that he has for the region, even if it's a China minus strategy, a positive agenda so that the United States can be a platform for growth, for stability, for other parties. And that's why he talked in terms of invest, align, and compete. And I would say, yes, there's much he can point to in terms of investment. I mean, the most active industrial strategy in the United States since the Roosevelt administration is being done by the Biden administration. In terms of alignment, yes, he's shown we want to engage with our regional partners at a minilateral level at least. But I'm afraid on the compete part, I don't think this is competing. I think he's trying to tilt the playing field and sort of, in a way, therefore, decouple China or isolate China and work with them. We'll have to see how that works. But at least it was respectful and it was not a Trump-era speech, and I think that's sufficient for the moment.
Henry Wong, I want to talk about what the Japanese Prime Minister had to say, but first, what is your view on these deep differences that the two sides have and the potential for them getting past that to get to some kind of agreement?
Yes, I think that it's quite risky if they pursue that. I really also see what happened in the war in Ukraine is really, something like this kind of a more secure alliance, more military probe, more military, set up. It's really going to push the world into a dangerous place. I mean, what we see what happened already in Ukraine. And so what about the Asia area? We don't want to see another NATO in Asia, of course. Mini NATO, for example, like a Quad, of course. I mean, AUKUS, and then we have Five Eyes. And now we have this IPEF, IPEF. But let's see, IPEF, if it's really economic oriented, let's involve China. China has joined the ASEAN. I mean, also is applying CPTPP. So if US wants to have another CPTPP or maybe similar to that, like IPEF, let's work with the largest economy in the region. So not really we're having all those military setup or security setup. So that's very, very dangerous. I think, that's accelerate things on many countries, like Japan, military budget is up and things like that. It's not really great. I mean, not really needed, actually. When the world is really facing the pandemic and now we're having a high inflation recession. So let's really work on the economic confidence of the world rather than on the military confidence of the world. So that's really the key difference. I think China is pursuing the economic
Henry,
confidence, AIP and things like that. Yes.
Right. I just want to get to what the Japanese Prime Minister had to say at the conference. He was talking about Japan's role, Japan's security role, that is, in Asia. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I would like to set a new era of realistic diplomacy that preserves through realism. Japan will not lose humility, flexibility to value diversity, and tolerance to respect the independence of the other party. But we will be more proactive in tackling the challenges and dangers faced by Japan, Asia, and the world.
So, Henry, there we have the Japanese Prime Minister saying that the country is going to be more proactive. He wants to build Japan's security as well. How will this be seen in Beijing?
Well, I think this is definitely not positive. It's very negative, of course, very dangerous, actually, as a matter of fact, because also we see the U.S. is really deliberately letting Japan now to really build up its military capacity budget, but also more some defense capability, rather, which Japan should not supposed to have. So that really, I think, alarms the region as well, because we know that the Asia suffered from the Japanese aggression 7 decades ago. But now, I mean, we should really maintain the global order that we had, in the last 7 decades, but then improve it, enhance it, but not really changing that. So I think if we are really changing the status quo, we're really, really have this military arms race. I mean, that's really dangerous for the region. I mean, I would say we should have economic race, economic competition, cooperation, but rather than arms race or military match up and also all the excess on that. So I think this sends a very bad signal. I think that will be definitely badly received in China.
Yeah. Jim Walsh, it seems what we're hearing here is that the United States wants to build its alliances in the region, but exclude China at the same time. I mean, isn't that counterproductive? Shouldn't the U.S. role be to include China in these discussions?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you define the purpose of an alliance to be. And I'm guessing some of these alliances China doesn't want to join. But listen, this is, as we all know, the world is made up of sovereign states, and states can align or de-align in whatever formations they want. And some of those can be threatening, and some of those cannot be threatening. All of these are long-term projects. I mean, the stuff we're dealing with now, COVID, Ukraine, recession, those are what's going to be the big determinants over the next 5 years. Who knows what the consequences of the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion will be? That could be even longer. These other initiatives, AUKUS, really at the very beginning, Japanese boosting its military forces, I'll believe it when I see it, because I've heard a lot of those statements before, and it doesn't ever seem to happen. So, okay, any of those things, for alliances or Japanese or behavior, they may happen, but that's a medium to long-term endeavor. We have much more big things to deal with right now.
Right. Jim, the new Australian Defence Minister, Richard Marles, he said that the Indo-Pacific is right now in the midst of the most consequential strategic alignment of our time. Is that a tacit acknowledgement in some way that the world order has changed?
Well, sure. I think the world order has changed. It also may reflect a lack of historical understanding. I mean, it was a big deal when the Vietnam War ended and Nixon said he was pulling back. It was a big deal during the Suez Crisis when the British Empire fell apart. I mean, there's a lot of things that, when the Soviet Union fell apart. There are a lot of things that have happened, over the recent history. And yes, things are now in what international relations scholars would say is a period of higher multipolarity rather than bipolarity or unipolarity. But it's really unclear how this is all going to play out. Yeah. There are definitely some bad scenarios, but there's nothing that requires that it end up in a bad place. This is up to human beings to make decisions and through diplomacy or other instruments try to find a way to solve their problems. So yes, things are changing. Yes, they're scary to people, but there's nothing that requires that this all lead to flames and destruction.
Okay. Anna Tangen, we've heard Ukraine being mentioned several times in this discussion. Now, the United States is urging China not to provide any material support to Russia. China has not provided any support to Russia. But how much does this strain the relationship between the United States and China? Because China, of course, is a sovereign state and exercises its own policies.
No, let's talk to Guatemala, Venezuela, Cuba about, the U.S. impartiality towards sovereign states. I mean, this is a lot of nonsense. I'm hearing this, things are changing, don't worry about it, the status quo. I disagree. I mean, the status quo has changed. You see that quite clearly over the last, 1.5 administrations. The pivot to Asia. All of this, sailing warships up and down the Taiwan Straits, that is not China. That is the United States. The United States, and I agree, is concerned, about China's rise. It's not the global order or anything like that, or it wouldn't be starting these wars. So it is a time to be concerned. You have an administration that is politically weak, looking at a drubbing in the midterms, change probably in the presidential side due to economic factors that it was not able to manage. Some are not its fault. It's just the way it is. But when it comes to the Ukraine war, definitely on that side. Now, in terms of why the U.S. is pushing this narrative that China is helping Ukraine when Ukraine was a prominent trade partner was integral to the Belt and Road Initiative. All those things are out the window. So this idea that somehow, you know, it's just a narrative from Washington trying to somehow paint China as the aggressor, as somehow aligned with Russia.
Saurabh, of course, China is building its own alliances in the region, albeit with some of the smaller countries in the region. We've seen recently it signed this security pact with the Solomon Islands. It's been reaching out to Fiji as well. How significant are those things? And as I say, these are smaller island nations.
Well, they're important, but I wouldn't say they're significant. China is trying to deepen its relationship with a wider set of partners in the Indo-Pacific, and it should be welcomed. Yes, I can understand concerns that if China is going too far, too fast, and that not all of these are very transparent as to what exactly those arrangements entail. From a security perspective, particularly, I can understand the Western countries having worries about it, especially because the Pacific Islands are on important sea lines of communication between Australia and Japan, and with regard to island chains, etc., etc. But the important point out here is Asia is looking, and I've said this before, Asia is looking for development. Asia is looking for prosperity. Yes, it does not want to be insecure, but prosperity, development, and security need to be managed. And the onus, the bias is a little bit more towards the development side. And that's why whoever has a strategy for engendering development and prosperity in Asia will always be welcomed. And therefore, I think all states just need to stand a little back and just understand how they can be contributors to an overall good, rather than dividing this into blocks or zero-sum games, frankly.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us.